Welcome, pilots, to my review of the Thrustmaster T.Flight HOTAS 4 for Eve Valkyrie. The HOTAS 4 is currently the only supported HOTAS stick for PlayStation, so you want to make sure and get the correct one, which I will put a link to in the description down below. For a HOTAS system, the HOTAS 4 is modestly priced, so it is an all-plastic construction. But that being said, it does have quite a good weight to it, and it does feel quite sturdy. The main stick and the thrust control can be held together, or they can be separated with a wire running from the thrust control across to the main stick, as seen here. All of the buttons on the HOTAS 4 controller are marked up with their equivalent buttons from the DS4 controller, so you will be familiar with them, if not their location on the stick right away. So, I do recommend that you take a little time to familiarize yourself with the location of the buttons, because you're not going to have the chance to take a quick peek when you're in the middle of a dogfight. The main stick has 3 axes: forwards, back, left, right, and a twist function. The thrust control has a notch in the center to keep it centered. When you move forwards and leave it, it will stay roughly wherever you've placed it, and the same when you move it backwards. In Eve Valkyrie, the thrust control is set as the default for your boost and your brake. The boost and the brake do become active quite close to the center of the thrust control, so you're not going to have to make big movements to actually get the boost or the brake to be active. Using the thrust control for your boost and your brake is of course going to be slower than just using a button for boost or brake. But you can change some buttons around a little to help you in those dogfights. For example, you can have your boost still remain on the thrust control, but you could map your brake onto, say, the X button, which is in a nice comfy resting place for your thumb on the thrust control. That way you can move yourself forwards for thrust and press the brake, and you immediately go onto the brake without the additional movement of the thrust control. This brings us nicely onto the subject of configuring your flight axes. This is quite a personal thing, but I'm going to take you over the different options that you have, and you'll just have to make up your mind as to what's going to suit you best. There is one control that I think most people would be in agreement about, and that's pushing forwards or pulling back on your main stick should control your pitch. There is something to note here in that the direction that you move with pushing forwards or pushing back seems to be inverted from whatever is selected on your DS4 controller. So you may have to press the options button and invert the controls from there to get the motion that you want for either the nose coming up or the nose going down. The default settings in Eve have your roll set to the left and right motion on your stick, and the twist is set to control the yaw or your rudder. However, you may actually prefer to switch those two around, and there are a number of pilots that I know already do that. For myself, I prefer having it on the default controls. You could of course also opt to use the rocker button on the front of the thrust control, so whichever one of those is going to become either your roll or your yaw is really up to you. Along with possibly changing some of the main flight controls to suit your taste, you may want to consider moving some of the buttons around as well, such as swapping your primary and secondary fire buttons. The default for the primary fire is the R1 button at the front of the stick. The default for the secondary fire is the L1 button at the back of the stick. Also at the back of the stick is the L3 button, which is used by default as your countermeasures. If you are like me in a fighter, I like to hold my missiles ready in the tube for when somebody comes along into my sights. However, with the L3 set to the countermeasures and my L1 as being my secondary fire, if somebody sneaks up behind me and I want to set off my countermeasures quickly, I may end up slipping my finger off of the missile button to press my countermeasures, releasing all the missiles I've got in my tube in blind fire. To prevent this, I simply swapped my secondary and my primary fires around. The other button you may want to relocate is the comms button, which by default is set to the R3. The R3 button is at the top right of the main stick. You activate a comm by holding in the R3 button, moving the hat switch and holding it in the direction of the comm you want to relate, and then release the R3 button. I found this very uncomfortable to do, so I moved the comm button from the R3 button to one of the others. The last feature to talk about is the ability to change the tension of the main stick's movement. This is done with a dial on the bottom base of the main stick. A quick cautionary note for left-handed players out there who are considering getting this stick. It is completely moulded for a right-handed use, so you may want to think again. Some of you may also have noticed there are foot pedals that can be bought to go along with this stick. However, I have to tell you straight away that these are not actually supported in Eve Valkyrie as of yet. They may come in the future, who knows, but for now, don't buy the pedals that can be connected to this stick, as they will not function in Eve Valkyrie for PSVR. Okay, that's more than enough for the configuration possibilities with the stick. What you really want to know before buying the stick is, how does it feel to play in game? Well, you're going to get different messages from different people there. For me, it feels a lot more immersive. For those of you who think getting a stick will make you more competitive, you may want to reevaluate that, because while you may be able to make smaller, more precise movements easier, it's going to take a lot more effort for you when you have to make bigger motions to get away from someone quick. For those of you moving from a controller to a HOTAS 4 stick, you're going to have to bear in mind that it's going to take some time for you to adjust and find out whether you're comfortable with it or not. For me, I'm finding it great fun, and I hope that anybody else who gets this stick enjoys it just as much. But for now, that's all from me, so fly safe, pilots.